believe if you would sit down, we could get started. If you're looking for the perfect Christmas gift to honor a friend, we're selling Christmas honorariums, and they're out there at the desk with Vivian Fleming, and they cost $20, and you honor one of your friends. It's the perfect gift for those who support the library. So stop by to see Vivian after the event. And I would like to thank the kitchen help, Carol Allen and Glenda Seegers and Ron Stevens and Philip Williams, and only very erudite people get to do that job. Today we have a great treat in store for us. Neil White has brought his book, 125 Years of Ole Miss Football, and I understand it's about more than just football. And Neil White, of course, is an author in his own right, and if you have not read The Sanctuary of the Outcast, you must read it. It is excellent, one of the best I've read by a Mississippi writer in a long time. He's also a publisher and has Nautilus Publishing, and they've published a biography by Chancellor Kayat, and you did Dr. Sansing's books, the governor, etc. And he also published our Presbyterian book, sesquicentennial book, The Light That Shines in Darkness, and it's just beautiful. So you may want to go by the Presbyterian Church and get one. But anyway, Neil, thank you for coming today, and we're looking forward to this. Hotty toddy.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? I'm Neil White, glad to be here. Margaret, nobody can see it because the real title of this book is Stories from 125 Years of Ole Miss Football. This is not your typical football book at all. It is... football was the impetus, but what we did was we didn't want to recycle the same old stories. We've hit the highlights and that sort of thing, but everybody we interviewed, the first question we asked them was, tell us something that not many people know about. So we got a lot of behind-the-scenes stories, a lot of stories we couldn't publish, but they were still interesting. Some that we walked the line with. But it was really a fascinating project, and I had the most fun doing it. The other thing that's really that really helped us a lot that really wasn't in any of the previous history books is almost every newspaper now is online. And so we could go back and scour the archives from newspapers all over the country, all over the South, to get these obscure reports about Ole Miss football players, football games, the governors who tried to influence football. And, you know, they used to have 2 full broadsheet pages about the football games, and they would include what their mothers were doing in the stands and whose thumb got cut off. And, I mean, you know, the list just went on and on and on. So what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes telling you some of the stories that give you a flavor for what this book is about, and we'll start with this man. His name is Alexander Bondurant. He was getting his PhD. He was coming to Ole Miss to be a professor, but in 1892, he was at Harvard, and he went to the Harvard-Princeton game, the Harvard-Yale game, and this is when football was flourishing in the Northeast. There were 30,000 people at the Harvard-Princeton game, and the net to each school was $15,000 apiece, and he thought this is just the greatest thing in the world. So he came to Ole Miss and proposed starting a football team. And the very first day of practice, 30 kids showed up, and he said they were going on a 4-mile run. Not a single one finished the 4-mile run, and 10 people dropped out that next day. So the initial team was this ragtag crew, and they went 4-1. He brought the Harvard football method to Ole Miss. They beat Tulane. They beat the Memphis Athletic Club. They only lost 1 game, and that was to the Southern Athletic Club in New Orleans. And it turned out that it was a group of former college players. They were like semi-pro would be today. today. And so the Ole Miss students put out a dispatch that they were undefeated in their inaugural season against other college men. Now, Bondurant knew that football was going to be good for the school, but just for the boys, and he believed in the virtues of athletic vigor. He actually wrote a couple of books about that, going back to Greek culture and the Olympics. But he also knew it was going to be about money. So football in the Northeast, they were just making tons of money for the university. So he thought the same thing would happen here. So the very first game that Ole Miss played where there was a gate, where people bought tickets, was in 1894. It was against Alabama. 2,000 or 3,000 people showed up, and the gate was $190. According to Clarion Ledger, most of the people jumped over the turnstile and refused to pay, so it didn't work out exactly the way that he thought it would. Another thing about this book that was interesting is, of the 125 years of football at Ole Miss, there were 2 years where we didn't field a football team. But something really important happened in both of those years. The first was in 1897. The football season was canceled because of yellow fever. And the football team had done well. I think our record was something like 18-4. And the former manager of the team in 1896 decided that he would start a yearbook. And so they held a contest to name the yearbook. And the winning entry up until the deadline was the Cotton Bowl. And then Elma Meek, a woman from Oxford, suggested that they name the yearbook the Ole Miss. And it was based on the old slave term that the slaves used to refer to the oldest white woman in the plantation house. And it's interesting, I've done a lot of research on this. It was not always a positive term. Many times the slaves were going, well, Ole Miss wants us to do this, or Ole Miss is. And so this was a student's sort of backhanded compliment to the university they loved by calling it Ole Miss. Now, this was never supposed to be the name of the school. It was only the name of the annual. But what you have to remember is that there were no radio stations, no TV stations, no even national magazines. There was nothing but newspapers. But the annual was wildly popular. And every year when the yearbook was published, they would send it to all the public libraries in the state. And everybody rushed to the library to see what was going on the college campus, what the styles were, how they were wearing their hair, what the romantic life was like, what the cheeky college students were writing about. And it was so popular and so scandalous sometimes that everybody in town would go to the library and read it. And before long, without anything official being acknowledged, everybody started calling the school Ole Miss. So it was just the name of the annual that ended up being what the school was called. So, football was popular. It was also remarkably violent. People could pile on, you could kick, you could bite, you could do whatever you wanted to. There were no rules against it. So in 1906, there were so many injuries. There were 18 deaths and 150 serious injuries in football. And President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, was a huge fan of football. So rather than have it banned, he got together in the White House with the coaches at Harvard and Princeton and Yale, and he said, we've got to keep this game. It's great for the youth of America. They hit the line hard, but we've got to make it safer. So they came up with some rules that got rid of some of the unnecessary roughness. The other thing that they did was they instituted the forward pass. But there was real skepticism. This is a cartoon that was published in the newspapers. This is Roosevelt having signed a treaty orchestrate a treaty between Russia and Japan to solve their war, but there was speculation, can he solve the beast that is football? But anyway, they did, and the forward pass was instituted. Now, in 1907, nobody in Ole Miss had ever passed the ball. So Bondurant and his cronies decided to hire a guy from Harvard who could come down and coach the team. And they hired a man from that 1892 team that Bondurant watched when he was at Harvard. It was this team. And the man they hired was a guy named Frank Mason. His nickname was Slugger Mason. He was fond of hitting first because the penalty flag was always thrown on the person who hit back. And that's the way he got his nickname, Frank Slugger Mason. So he was supposed to come in and revolutionize Ole Miss football. Well, in 1907, the team was absolutely dreadful. They couldn't pass. All of the large students had already graduated. They went 0-5. They didn't score a single time in the season except against Missouri Normal School. They scored one touchdown. 195 points were scored against Ole Miss. They scored 6. They were voted the second worst college team in the history of college football in the 1980s. And to top things off, in the last game of the year against Mississippi State in Jackson, this group of boys, it was so cold, it was so rainy, they were complaining about it, so he decided to lace the coffee urn with whiskey to warm up the team. And by halftime, the boys were completely drunk, and they lost to Mississippi State 0-15. So at the end of this game, a reporter asked Slugger Mason if he was headed back to Oxford, and his exact quote was, "The boys are headed north. I'm going in the opposite direction, and it's fine with me if I never see them again." So that was Slugger Mason's tenure at Ole Miss. But then 3 years later, most people don't know about this, the 1910 team was coached by a scholar named Nathan Stauffer. And this team was in many respects better than the heralded 1959 team. And the similarities are stunning. I don't think you can see this chart very well, but if you look in the book, they both lost one game. They both had shutouts against 7 and 8 teams. The 1910 team had fewer points scored by average than the 1959 team, which is considered the best defense of all time. And you've all heard about the Billy Cannon punt return, even those of you who aren't football fans. That was an 89-yard punt return fluke play that Ole Miss lost by. This 1910 team lost on a fluke 90-yard run against Vanderbilt. So the similarities between the two teams are really, really remarkable. So the following year, in 1911, because of the popularity of this 1910 team, they decided to build grandstands in Jackson. And so they decided they would build it for about 2,000 people. John McCall, who was a star of that 1910 team, his uncle, D.D. McCall, was given the contract without any bids to build that grandstand. And before the state game, it collapsed with 1,000 people on it. 60 were injured, including the lieutenant governor and William Hemingway, who was the director of the athletics. So, not much has changed in the way that things are done in politics. That's even back in 1911. So the next story I want to tell you about is how politics has always played a role in football. Many of you know that in the 60s, when Ole Miss was competing nationally, there was a rule against playing any team where there was a black player, which cost us probably a national championship that was undisputed. But this has been going on for a long time. So in 1920, the governor Lee Russell, who was elected in 1919, was from Oxford, Mississippi. He went to Ole Miss and was rejected by all of the fraternities, and he hated the Greek system. And I've got some issues with it myself, but he wanted to ban fraternities. So he banned all Greek organizations at Ole Miss. There was already a law in the books that had never been enforced. But he asked every student on campus to sign a pledge that they would not only not join a Greek social club, but that they would not participate in dances or parties. He thought it added to the moral decay of the students. Well, about 25 students refused to sign the pledge, including a 19-year-old freshman named William Faulkner, and the captain of our football team, a guy whose name is Calvin Barber. They also marched across campus. Remember, this was the beginning of the Roaring '20s. No dances. They marched across campus with an effigy of Governor Russell. So they expelled all of the students who marched, including Calvin Barber and our 3 other best players. It decimated the 1920 team, and we had a terrible season that year. Now, it's often the case for people who are holding that flag on high moral ground. In 1923, Governor Russell was sued for seduction by his stenographer. She was impregnated. There was an abortion. It was botched. She was in a wheelchair, and on the front page page of the New York Times, there was the $100,000 lawsuit against Governor Russell, who had banned dancing on the Ole Miss campus. Just as an FYI, this stenographer was introduced to Governor Russell by his dear friend Theodore Bilbo, who was quite the ladies' man. So this is the sort of stories that are in the book. So anybody who says, I don't want a football book, tell them, trust me, read it. It's about a lot more than football. So in 1921, Ole Miss was invited to go play football in Havana in what's called the Bacardi Bowl, and they played the Cuban Athletic Club. And so the basketball and football team got on a boat in New Orleans and sailed to Cuba. The football team played on New Year's Eve, and the basketball team played afterwards. Now, Alabama and State and Tulane had been invited, and they had all beaten the Cubans. Calvin Barber, the one who was pictured who was suspended and expelled, finally came back on the team, and he recounted the game that in the very first play, Ole Miss scored a touchdown, and the referees from Cuba threw a flag and called it back. There were 3 touchdowns called back for penalties, and Ole Miss lost 14-0. He said he knew it was going to be a really long night when one of the players was kicked in the crotch, and the referee turned around and ignored it. So it was sort of set up from the beginning, but Ole Miss had a great time, and there are lots of stories about romance on the ship and people giving their M Club sweaters to women that they met on that trip. So pretty remarkable thing. It was also our very first postseason game, although I don't know that we actually earned it. So in 1925, Ole Miss finally got serious about football. We had lost something like 13 in a row to Mississippi State. And the students had been in charge of the football team, and so an alumnus, group of alums, one from Holly Springs, decided that the adults should get involved, and they hired Homer Hazel, who was a 2-time All-American from Rutgers. And Homer Hazel brought to Ole Miss for the first time real football, real strategy, real playbooks, and a desire to win. So he did a couple of things for Ole Miss that I'll tell you about, but during that first 2 years, 1925, 1926, 2 things happened that were significant. The first is, in order to quit fights after the State Ole Miss game, they decided to come up with a trophy, and that trophy is that huge egg-shaped trophy that they give away now. It wasn't called the Egg Bowl until the 80s, but the Egg Trophy was started in 1926. 1926 is also the very first time that the cheer Hotty Toddy was heard in the stands. It was a little bit different. It was hoity-toity, highty-tighty, but it ended up being hotty-toddy, so for the first time. So Homer Hazel brought 2 things. The first is he recruited great players, and one of the greatest players, and one of the funniest stories and the most little known, was a man from the Delta named, that's Homer Hazel, named Solly Cohen. Has anybody ever heard of Solly Cohen? He was Ole Miss's very first All-Star. He was elected an All-Star for the Southern Conference, and he was a fullback. He was the child of Russian immigrants and Jewish, and back then, no political correctness, his nickname was Jew. I don't know if you can see that on there, but the fact that Jew was selected, that was how it was printed in the annual. But to go a little bit further than that, they invited his mother to a game, and afterwards, a reporter interviewed her, and in the newspaper, the reporter said, "What do you think of football?" And this is a woman who's from Russia. She said, "Not so good. I hear other side yelling, 'Get the big Jew, get the big Jew.'" And those are then the newspaper reports that not many people have seen, so I love that. The other player that arrived that year was Tad Smith, who Tad Smith Coliseum is named for, long-term athletic director at Ole Miss. He came from Brookhaven, Mississippi, and on his way, on the drive to Ole Miss, he went over 92 one-way bridges to get to Ole Miss. And I don't know that he ever went back to Brookhaven. He pretty much stayed in Oxford the whole time. But his claim to fame was that he never called a fair catch on a punt, no matter what. He was remarkably aggressive in that regard. And he refused to wear a helmet. I don't know if you knew that. He had these huge ears. But to be aerodynamic, he would tape his ears back. And it became a thing that the Ole Miss players did. So they all taped their ears back during his era to make sure that they could run as fast as possible. The other thing that Homer Hazel did for Ole Miss was he came up with the very first nickname for the team. Does anybody know what that nickname was? It was 1930. It was the Flood. So we didn't have an official nickname. We were called the Red and Blue or the Mighty Mississippians or the University Boys, and it was not very convenient for headline writers, especially in the newspapers. So they held a contest, and Homer Hazel was in charge of making the final decision. And the first place winner was the Flood, based on the Mississippi flood. And there was all this rationale that you can calm waves and you can deal with tides, but nobody can escape a flood. So there was some logic behind it. The second place winner in that contest was Rebels, and there was a tie for third place between the Democrats and the Old Masters. So it could have been a lot worse than what we are now as Rebels. So move forward 5 years, and there is a gentleman named Billy Gates, who is sports editor of the Daily Mississippian. Billy was just this remarkable man, and he hated the nickname the Flood, and it didn't catch on. You can almost find no headlines with them referring to the Ole Miss team as the Flood. So Billy decided that he would call another contest. And so the sports writers all around the South asked for new names for Ole Miss, and there were 5 finalists. It was Rebels, Raiders, Confederates, Stonewalls, or just simply Ole Miss. Now this time Chancellor Butts was in charge at Ole Miss, and he came to Billy and he said, we have tallied, it was a committee of 7 who decided, and he said, we have tallied the results, and I give you this reluctantly. The vote was 4-3. 4 votes for Rebels and 3 votes just to simply call the team Ole Miss. So it came through with just the slightest of margins, but that's what happened, and we've been the Rebels ever since. Now, another thing about Billy Gates is he was not only a journalist and a great reporter, he was a remarkable publicist, and he ended up being the sports information director for Ole Miss, and he wanted somebody from Ole Miss to be an All-American. So you've all probably heard of the great Bruiser Kennard, who was a tackle. He could run the 100 yards and 10 flat. He was huge. Nobody could stop him. So Billy Gates decided to launch a campaign to try and make Bruiser Kennard an All-American. And what he would do, he would take photographs and just print them by the hundreds and pack these envelopes with stories about the escapades of Bruiser Kennard, and he mailed them to everybody who voted for the All-American candidates. Now, what's interesting here is he didn't want to stuff all those envelopes, so he hired an intern, a little 15-year-old kid from Memphis named Harold Burson. So Burson, at 15, was Billy Gates' right-hand person, and they stuffed all the envelopes, and every week they sent them to the reporters, and Bruiser Kennard ended up getting All-American. Well, Harold Burson graduated 4 years later, and he watched what Billy Gates did to get this All-American elected, and he decided to apply that in the private sector. So Harold Burson moved to Manhattan and started a public relations firm called Burson Marstellers, used the same techniques that Billy Gates used in the private sector, and built the largest public relations firm in the world. In 1983, it sold for $5.3 billion, and it was all begun on the Ole Miss campus trying to get some not really bright football player voted All-American. So anyway, I thought that was a fascinating story. Mr. Burson's still alive. He's 97, lives in Memphis, and he came to a signing event we had there and spoke. So it's pretty remarkable to talk to somebody who was there on the ground when somebody was trying to get Bruiser Kennard elected as an All-American. I've got a couple more stories to tell, but I want to stop for a second to give myself a break and ask if y'all have any questions. Sort of get a feel for what the book is like, more than football? Okay, good. I'll just keep on going then. So, in the 30s, we went to our first bowl, and we had a great team, and we had some good coaches. But in 1938, we decided to hire a man named Harry Mayer from Georgia. This is Coach Mayer. On the right is Junie Hovius, and on the left is I think that's either Parker Hall or it might be Merle Hapes. At any rate, he was a great coach, and his first 4 years, he had the highest winning percentage of any Ole Miss coach ever, even higher than Johnny Vaught. His win percentage from 1938 to 1941 was over 800. It was he won 80% of his games. He had players like Parker Hall and Merle Hapes and Wobble Davidson, who ended up being a great coach, Junie Hovius, the Pool Boys, Charlie Connerly. He recruited him as a freshman. But in 1941, when the war broke out, the team was just gutted by the draft and people signing up for World War II. And Harry Mayer started to lose, and he started drinking, and he ended up really being sort of a broken man before he left Ole Miss. In his heyday, he was flying in airplanes and was going all over the country with his team. And then in 1943, football was canceled. And so remember I told you there were 2 years where remarkable things happened? 1897 with the yearbook. This 1943 year, all his coaches left to fight in the war, and so he was charged with training the Ole Miss cadets who were still in school with hand-to-hand combat, getting them in shape for the war, and he hired a staff to assist him. And all of the great coaches were taken, so he hired a guy second to left, a fellow by the name of Eddie Kayat from Moss Point, Mississippi. Eddie was a teacher, and he was enthusiastic, but his family had never been associated with Ole Miss. They were Millsaps and Tulane people. But in that year, 1943, Eddie moved his family up to Oxford. He had a 5-year-old son named Robert Kayat. They lived in number 1 Faculty House in Oxford. The family together saw their first snow, and it was the very first time that the Kayats had any association with Ole Miss. And for those of you who aren't Ole Miss fans, who don't know this, his son Robert ended up coming back to play at Ole Miss, be the chancellor at Ole Miss, and really built the school up in ways that probably nobody has since the early chancellors from the early days. So again, one of those remarkable intersections of fate when we didn't actually field a football team. So the next person I want to tell you about is somebody that you may have heard about from Ole Miss sports lore, but most people don't know this. Merle Hapes, who was of the Hovius Hapes great punt returners, was an All-American who was drafted by the New York Giants. This is the publicity photo. It's Hapes on the right, Hovius on the left. So he was selected to play for the Giants, and he was doing great. They were winning all over. And in 1946, right before the national championship game, Mr. Hapes was out one night with a gambler who offered him $3,000 to lay down and blow the championship game. Word got back to the NFL, and he was arrested, investigated, and ended up admitting that he was offered a bribe but contended that he never took the money. But what's interesting about this, and this is what we do in this book, we're going to tell the truth no matter what. Merle Hapes is the only man ever to be banned for life by the NFL. And he ended up living in Biloxi, Mississippi, retired, coached high school football, but just one of those things you never hear from the Ole Miss publicity department, obviously, but pretty fascinating and he went to his deathbed promising that he never took any money and claims that he didn't. But so we hear all about these scandals now in the NFL, cheating, drug use, deflating footballs, that sort of thing, but you can hang your hat that the only guy who ever got the lifetime ban was an Ole Miss alum. So we got that going for us. 1951, this guy, Showboat Boykin, he was a great running back, but he was plagued by injuries. Now this is in the Vaught era. And Vaught had a rule that he did not allow football players to be married. That rule was instituted after the veterans who came back and played for Vaught from 47 to 51. Most of them were married, and I think that was the impetus for changing the rule in the future. This man, against the Mississippi State Bulldogs in 1951, walked into the huddle and said, "I just had a fight with my wife, give me the damn ball." He scored 7 touchdowns that day against Mississippi State. It was an NCAA record for over 30 years and is still the SEC record. So I'm not sure that Vaught should have really kept that rule. It might be a little better if our players were madder at their wives. So just an interesting tidbit about that record that everybody knows about. A lot of you have heard of this guy, John Dotley. He was from Arkansas. His name was everybody knew him as K.O. Dotley. His father was a boxing coach. This was probably one of the finest athletes that ever played at Ole Miss. The way he got his nickname was in 2nd grade, he would go to his dad's boxing gym, and he was doing great, and they started calling him K.O., the initials K.O. And in 3rd grade in Arkansas, they were taking roll and checking students' names, and teacher said, "What's your name?" And he said, K.O. Dotley, and she spelled it K-A-Y-O, and that's how it was for the rest of his career, not knockout, but K.O. So K.O. set all sorts of records at Ole Miss. He still has the single-season rushing record. He rushed for 1,312 yards. That record stood for 28 years in the SEC. He went to the pros, and he played for the Chicago Bears. And this is just one of the headlines. He was one of the best running backs. He was the very first rookie to ever play in the Pro Bowl. George Halas said he was the finest athlete he had ever coached. So here's what happened. K.O. was at a hotel in Chicago on a windy night after his first season. He was in a fur coat. He was a flashy guy at the time, and he was waiting outside the hotel with a friend for the valet to bring his car. Neither one of them were paying attention. The valet was drunk. K.O. was standing behind another car. The valet pinned his legs between 2 cars, and he never recovered. And he retired from the NFL due to leg injuries. You've all heard the Marcus Dupree story, the best there never was. This is a similar story with K.O. Dotley. Had he not suffered that injury, he might have gone on to break all sorts of records in the NFL and done remarkable things. But a really, really fine guy. So got maybe 2 more stories that I want to tell. This one, do y'all recognize this player, Bobby Ray Franklin? He's from Clarksdale. Bobby Ray was a fine high school player, and Coach Vaught wanted to recruit him. So he went to Clarksdale to visit the family, and in the car with him was a former Ole Miss player, Farley Salmon, who was a great Ole Miss player as well, and from Clarksdale. And he was going on the recruiting trip with Coach Vaught, and he warned Coach Vaught on the way over. He said, "Let me tell you, Ms. Franklin is a devoutly religious woman. Be careful what you say, Coach Vaught." So they get to the house, and Miss Franklin is in a tizzy. She says, "Oh my gosh, everybody wants Bobby Ray. Mississippi State wants Bobby Ray. LSU wants Bobby Ray. Arkansas wants Bobby Ray. Ole Miss wants Bobby Ray. I don't know what to do, Coach Vaught." And Coach Vaught said, "Miss Franklin, I don't know what to do either. There's only one thing to do. Let's pray about it." They both got on their knees and prayed. We signed Bobby Ray, and he was an All-American and a great star at Ole Miss. So you think people haven't been doing whatever it takes to recruit for years? I promise you they have. You've probably all heard of Charlie Connerly, great Ole Miss player, really set the tone for Johnny Vaught's career. But what a lot of people don't know who don't follow pro football is he went to the New York Giants, was coached there. His offensive coordinator was Vince Lombardi. Vince Lombardi said about him, toughest guy I'd ever met. But he and Perry Ann Connerly had no children. They were wonderfully social people, and they were really the toast of New York. They went everywhere, even after he was retired. That's him with the Kennedys. This was Charlie Connerly. A lot of you know this. He was the very first Marlboro man. He was the one on the commercials and in the ads. He was just this strapping, handsome, tough guy who was also just a sweetheart. And one of his favorite friends in New York was a guy named Toots Shore. Have y'all ever heard of Toots Shore? He had the big, they called them sort of show halls back then, but it was a restaurant, nightclub in Manhattan. And he loved Charlie Connerly. And Toots Shore knew everybody. That's him with Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio. There are pictures of him with Muhammad Ali. And he knew just about everybody. So in 1968, This was a couple of years after the Jets had started in New York. They were not as popular as the Giants. They were in the new AFL. But in 1968, they won the Super Bowl. And so Joe Namath shows up at Toots Shore's restaurant and demands a table. And the maitre d' said, "Mr. Namath, we don't have a table." And he said, "I want to see the owner." So she goes back and gets Toots Shore, and he walks out and he sees Namath with his entourage in his full-length fur coat. He says, "What can I do for you, sir?" He said, "We need a table." And he said, "We don't have a table." He said, "Well, get somebody to move." And Toots Shore said, "Who do you think you are, Charlie Connerly?" Heard that from Perry Ann firsthand. One other quick story, more in the modern era. Y'all know Tommy Tuberville, who's running for Senate in Alabama. Well, he coached at Miami before he coached at Ole Miss, and he coached a great linebacker named Ray Lewis, who ended up probably being the best linebacker of all time in the NFL. And Ole Miss had a young freshman named Deuce McAllister, and Tommy Tuberville told Deuce his freshman year, "I'm going to make you the next Ray Lewis. We're going to put you at linebacker." And of course, Deuce was a running back. That's what he wanted to do. So for a week, Deuce McAllister played linebacker at Ole Miss while John Avery was the starting running back. Deuce went to his dorm room. He called the coach at Jackson State. He called the coach at Memphis. He called the coach at Southern. He was planning to transfer. The next day, John Avery sprained his ankle and was out for 2 weeks. Deuce McAllister went back to play running back, and the rest is history, and Ole Miss history, and Saints history. But it's just those twists of fates that I find so fascinating, the way that things play out. So in addition to these kind of stories, in the back of the book are lots of lists and statistics, and I'll just share one of them with you. I don't even know if you can see this. Can y'all see that? This is the list in order of the coaches' salaries, the highest salary ever. Homer Hazel's highest salary was $8,000. John Vaught's highest salary was $27,000. Of course, I'm sure it was supplemented by private funds. Billy Brewer's highest salary was $210,000. Hugh Freeze's highest salary was $4.7 million. And Matt Luke is making $3 million right now. So it's this sort of thing in the back that if you just look at the progression of football and the business that it's in, the records that are set, it's a fascinating thing to all see in one place. So that's it for my review, if y'all have any questions.
What about Archie Manning and 4 interceptions?
Okay, so I was interviewing Archie, and I said, "So tell me something that nobody knows." And he said, "Well, if I could do anything, I'd like to tell you about Wobble Davidson. He coached the freshman team at Ole Miss. Up until the 70s, the freshmen couldn't play. And he really toughened them up and taught them how to practice. They played 4 games a year, and the first 2 games, didn't matter who you were going to play both ways. You were going to play on offense and on defense. So the quarterback was the safety, the wide receiver was the cornerback. So the first 2 games that Archie Manning played at Ole Miss, he played defense. And he, in those 2 games, had 4 interceptions, 3 against Alabama. Sorry, Jeff. So, and that just goes to show you what a great athlete it was. I didn't put this in the book, but Archie said also that Wobble Davidson, he gave nicknames to everybody. The guy was just brilliant and brutal at the same time. Archie came in at about 165 pounds, 6'3", red hair, big nose, big ears. His nickname was Ichabod. That's what Wobble Davidson called Archie. But he said he toughened him up, that he really was a huge part of the success of Vaught's crew. But he left in 1968 because Vaught didn't enforce the rules evenly. If you were a really good player, it didn't matter. You could do whatever you wanted to. But if you broke the rules and you weren't, he kicked you off the team. And Wobble Davidson was an old school military guy who, you follow the rules or you don't. And he got tired of that double standard and he quit and went and worked for the pros, scouting for the 49ers and coaching for other teams. The other thing Archie said was in that 3rd game, I guess whatever one was close, it wasn't the Vandy game, his freshman year, he passed so poorly that as he came running off the field, Wobble Davidson said to him, "Manning, it's a good thing there's gravity because you couldn't hit the ground if you tried to today." Other questions? Yes?
You named Billy Ray Adams
in the early 60s. And he's kind of like K.O. Dotley, and he had an accident coming back from Jackson touchdown club. And he ran off the Natchez Trace and just tore his body badly, and he never even played pro ball. But he was an all-American running back. And I'm sure you got some information on that.
I do, Mr. Weir. Yeah, Billy Ray Adams, that's exactly right. He was injured after the season. He was headed home before he was leaving to go to the All-American banquet in New York to go back to the airport. And not only was it an accident on the Natchez Trace, he was unconscious and on the side of the road for about 6 hours. Somebody picked him up, took him to the hospital at Kosciuszko. He never recovered physically. Vaught always said we lost that Cotton Bowl. He thought if Billy Ray had been there, he would have won. But they also had an interesting relationship, Vaught and Billy Ray. You know, there were so many. There's Bobby Ray Franklin and Billy Ray Adams. So his nickname, Billy Ray Adams, who's an All-American, Vaught called him Bobby Roy, just for the hell of it. Always called him Bobby Roy, Bobby Roy. And Billy Ray told this story a couple of weeks ago. He said, finally, he went to Coach Vaught and he said, you know, Coach Vaught, you never do call me by my right name. He said, that's right, Bobby Roy. He said, why not? And he said, I always remember the names of people who contribute greatly to this program. So just hysterical stuff. But they obviously had a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Neil, one thing that's interesting that you mentioned all these different salaries. When Ray Thornton and I were talking about this the other day, we were freshmen, and they assigned a freshman to a varsity, and Barney Pooh was mine because we played the same position.
You're kidding. Oh, that's great.
And
I love it.
He called me in on weekends. They gave him 6 tickets for every game, and he said, Piggy, I'm sorry, my mother can't come. You've got to sell these tickets. $6 a ticket. My dad and his friends had great 40-yard line tickets, but now I understand they're $75.
No, that's probably right.
I want to tell you something I think is really interesting, is that in 41, the 41 freshman class at Ole Miss had 4 All-Americans.
That's right.
And of course, then they all went to war, and they all didn't come back to Ole Miss.
Doug Keena didn't, right? And
But we had 4 All-Americans. Think what we could have done if they hadn't had that war.
that's right. And that was Harry Mayer's year that everything was decimated. That his freshman team that he had recruited had those 4 All-Americans, and it included Charlie Connerly and the Pools and Buddy Bowen, who won the Jacobs blocking trophy. And
Buddy's my husband. Was my husband.
oh, is that right? Okay. Well, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah,
He was a tough guy. Yeah.
He was the quarterback of Vaught's first team in 47, and they won the Southeastern Conference Championship.
They sure did.
Before that, when Harry Mayer was there, he ran the Notre Dame Box.
That's right.
And so Buddy actually was the quarterback with Charlie Connolly. But he would call the play, get the ball, and give it to, and then pass it, and then he would block for Charlie. And Charlie would throw it on down to Barney Pooh.
That's exactly right. I should have interviewed you for this book. That's but yeah, and we take for granted, you know, how the names now, but basically there was the line, there was the quarterback, the halfback, the fullback. I mean, it was based on positions, and they've all changed now. But well, I'm glad to know that. And Buddy's son Bo is on the back cover of this book. Yes.
I've seen it demonstrated, but I do not know the word, but in the book is the cheer, the flood in the book.
No, the flood cheer is not. I don't even know what it sounds like. Do you know
I
it?
demonstrated a couple times, and the gentleman, you go up and down a whole lot, but it was extremely funny. I mean, it had something to do with flood of 27 or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the flood of 27, and you know it tore up the Mississippi Delta, and Louisiana. So I'm not sure it was the best nickname. Didn't bring back fond memories. Yeah.
Neil, one thing the war did that you talking about Barney, we stayed in touch. He was in Jackson until he passed away, head of the stadium. He probably played more college football than any player I've ever known because he did not go to the Army. He had a little problem with his knee. He played at pre-flight up in North Carolina. He played 3 years in the Army and came back to Ole Miss. So I don't know how many years he played college football, but it was a lot.
He played 7 years of college football. He sure did. They made exceptions back then. And my understanding is that I can't remember who went up to recruit him at one of the academies, and he said, I can't get out. He wanted to come back and play for Ole Miss. It was either his brother, it was Buster? Buster went up. Buster went up there and said, we need you to come play for Ole Miss. He said, I'm here. And they got their heads together and said, how could you possibly get out of this commitment to play for the armed services? Was it Army? Was it Army he was playing? Army. And his older brother said, fail your classes. So he got kicked out and got back to play for Ole Miss. Yes, he played 7 seasons. Yeah. There's a great K.O. Dotley story, too. Right before his senior year, when he broke all the records, he had some knee trouble, but was still a great runner. They were trying to draft him, and he went over to Arkansas to his hometown draft board, and Coach Vaught was like, whatever you can do, just please get out of it. And the guy got him in for his physical and said, do a deep knee bend. And K.O. was 85 when he did this. He did a real deep knee bend and yelped, and was, oh my God. He said it wasn't lying, it just really hurt him. And the guy deemed him unfit for service and sent him back to Ole Miss. So, yes?
Didn't Doug Keno, who was on that freshman group she was talking about, didn't he go on to play at Army?
I think he did, yeah, and was an All-American. Sure did, yeah.
I'm glad to hear what you said about Walter Davidson being so strict, because he was my freshman year, I had him for tennis, and I got a bid. So I should got an A. And I had like the 3rd highest scores or whatever of the girls. We definitely separated the girls from the boys. But I'm glad to hear that, because that quite has bothered me for years, and I ran into Coach Davidson a few years after that in another circumstance, and I told him I was still upset with my bid.
He was apparently, and Archie said this too, he was so rough on the football players, but when they came back to town, he was the one they went to see. They appreciated what he did for them and the shape he got them in and the way he treated everybody equally. Yeah, he was beloved, although pretty vicious at times too. All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.